The wind was biting, snowflakes fell gently on the frozen sidewalk. A man in an expensive suit knelt on the cold ground, his palms trembling as they touched the wet pavement. Behind him, two police officers stood with their arms crossed, their eyes full of power. They didn't know that this man was not just an ordinary citizen. They didn't know that their actions tonight would ruin their careers the next morning. What happened on that cold night? And why, after just one day, did this man have the power to fire the officers who had humiliated him? Before we get into the story, please let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another inspiring story, made just for you. The story begins. Michael Chun rubbed his tired eyes as he drove his black Toyota Camry through the deserted streets of downtown Baltimore. The digital clock on the dashboard read 11:45 p.m., and the temperature made him grateful for the car's heater. It was a frigid 20 degrees Fahrenheit minus 6 degrees Celsius, with snow starting to fall lightly, adding to his exhaustion after a 5-hour budget meeting with the city council. As chairman of the finance committee, Michael had spent the entire evening debating the allocation of funds to various city departments, including the police force. The meeting was particularly tense when discussing the police department's request for increased funding for military-grade equipment. Michael had strongly opposed this, arguing that the money should be spent on community programs and officer training. The streets were quiet, with only a few cars occasionally passing by. Michael was looking forward to getting home to his wife, Emily, who had probably left his dinner in the microwave as she always did when he worked late. His house was only 15 minutes away, and he could already picture himself sinking into his comfortable armchair with a plate of warm food. The flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror startled him. Michael checked his speedometer. He was driving within the speed limit. Confused but calm, he signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, making sure to stop under a street light so he could be clearly visible. His father, a former police officer, had taught him all the proper procedures for traffic stops. The two officers approached his car, one on each side. Their flashlights shone directly into the window, making it difficult for Michael to see their faces. The officer on the driver's side rapped sharply on his window with his knuckles, even though Michael had already lowered it. License and registration, the officer demanded without a greeting. The name on his nameplate was Davis. His tone carried a cadence Michael had heard far too often in his 15 years of public service, a blend of unwarranted aggression. "Good evening, officer," Michael said politely, slowly reaching for his wallet. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Davis's partner, whose nameplate read Wilson, shifted his stance, moving his hand to rest on his gun holster. A subtle yet unmistakable tactic of intimidation that wasn't lost on Michael. "Your right taillight is broken," Davis stated, though Michael knew this to be false. He had just had his car serviced the previous week. "I'm sorry, but I believe there may be some confusion," Michael replied calmly. "I had my vehicle inspected last week and all the lights were in perfect working order." The temperature seemed to drop even further as Officer Davis's demeanor changed. He straightened up, puffing out his chest to assert his authority. "Step out of the car, sir." Michael felt his heart rate quicken, but he kept his voice steady. "Officer, it's freezing cold out here and I don't see any reason why I said step out of the car." Davis's voice boomed. In the stillness of the night, a few lights flickered on in nearby buildings. Curious residents peered out from their windows, watching the scene unfold below. Michael knew his rights, but he was also well aware of the reality of the situation. As a city council member, he had heard countless complaints about police misconduct, but experiencing it firsthand was entirely different. With deliberate movements, he unfastened his seatbelt and opened the car door. The icy air hit him immediately. His suit jacket offered little protection against the biting wind and the snowflakes that were now starting to settle on his shoulders. His leather shoes crunched on the thin layer of snow that had already accumulated on the sidewalk. "Hands where we can see them," Officer Wilson commanded. The beam of his flashlight followed Michael's every move. Michael raised his hands slightly, maintaining his composure despite the demeaning situation. He noticed that both officers had turned off their body cameras, a direct violation of department policy. This realization sent a chill down his spine, unrelated to the weather. What happened next would change not only Michael's life, but also the future of the police department. Yet, at that moment, standing in the freezing cold with two aggressive officers, Michael Chun was just another citizen facing the harsh reality of unchecked power, or so the officers thought. The city council member took a deep breath of the frigid air. His mind raced with thoughts of the consequences tomorrow. But first, he had to survive tonight's encounter with his dignity, and possibly his safety intact. Officer Davis circled Michael like a shark, his boots crunching on the fresh snow. The streetlights cast long shadows on the ground, and the few onlookers at their windows now had their phones out, recording the scene from above. "So you think you know more than a police officer?" Davis asked, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "You want to argue about your taillight?" He was shorter than Michael but carried himself with the swagger of someone accustomed to being in control. Michael stood perfectly still, his expensive suit now dusted with snowflakes. The wind had picked up, making the 20-degree weather feel even colder. His fingers were starting to numb, but he kept them in sight as instructed, knowing that any wrong move could escalate the situation. "No, sir," Michael replied calmly. "I simply wanted to point out that there might be a misunderstanding." His corporate training on handling difficult situations was proving useful even as his teeth began to chatter. Officer Wilson, the younger of the two, kept his flashlight trained on Michael while peering into the car's interior through the window. "Hey Davis, this guy's got some fancy stuff in here. Custom leather seats, high-end laptop in the back." "Oh really?" Davis's tone shifted to one of mock interest. "So you're one of those rich guys who thinks they're above the law?" He paused in front of Michael, deliberately invading his personal space. The officer's face was so close that Michael could smell the coffee on his breath. A car passed by, slowing down to observe, but quickly drove off when Davis glared in their direction. The snow was falling heavier now, and Michael's dress shoes were completely inadequate for the weather. His feet felt like blocks of ice. "I assure you, Officer Davis, I have the utmost respect for the law," Michael said, maintaining his composure. He considered pulling out his city council badge but decided to wait, wanting to experience exactly what ordinary citizens faced in these situations. "Prove it," Davis said with a smirk. "Since you're so respectful, drop down and give me 20 push-ups right here, right now." Michael blinked in disbelief. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Davis said, his hand resting casually on his taser. 20 push-ups. Consider it a lesson in humility, unless you'd prefer us to search your car for anything illegal." Officer Wilson chuckled, already pulling out his personal phone to record the intimidation. The threat was clear: comply or face worse consequences. Michael glanced down at the wet, icy sidewalk, then at the officers' badges, memorizing their numbers. "The ground is frozen," Michael said quietly, "and this is hardly standard procedure for a traffic stop." Davis stepped even closer. "Oh, so now you're an expert on police procedure? Make it 30 push-ups then, and for every complaint, I'll add 10 more." Michael could see the exhaust from his car forming warm clouds in the frigid air, a reminder of the comfort he had been in just moments ago. More lights had come on in the surrounding buildings, more phones recording from the windows above. The entire scene was being documented, though the officers seemed oblivious or indifferent. Slowly, Michael lowered himself to the ground. The icy sidewalk immediately soaked through the knees of his dress pants. He placed his hands on the wet pavement, the cold biting into his palms like needles. His wedding ring clinked against the frozen concrete. "Count loud," Davis ordered, clearly enjoying his power trip. "And make sure they're proper push-ups, no half-assing it here." Michael began the push-ups, his voice remaining steady despite the humiliation. 1, 2, 3. With each descent, his tie brushed against the slushy mud. His expensive suit, the one that had impressed the city council just hours earlier, was being ruined. Officer Wilson circled, him recording everything on his phone while adding his own commentary. "This is what happens when people don't respect authority," he said to the camera, laughing loudly. What neither officer noticed was that Michael's wallet had slowly slid out of his jacket pocket as he continued the push-ups. It would flip open in a few moments, revealing his city council badge and changing the entire dynamic of this frigid winter night. But for now, Michael continued to count, his arms trembling from both the cold and the exertion as he directly experienced the abuse of power he had heard about so many times in council meetings. Tonight was about to take an unexpected turn, and tomorrow would bring changes that neither Officer Davis nor Wilson could have imagined. 28, 29, 30. Michael counted the final push-ups, his arms shaking from the cold and the effort. His once pristine navy suit was now soaked with snow and mud. Small pebbles dug into his palms, leaving painful indentations. The officer circled him, deliberately flicking dirty snow near Michael's face. "Not bad for a rich kid," he taunted, while Officer Wilson continued filming on his phone, chuckling at his colleague's remarks. As Michael began to rise from the icy ground, something fell out of his jacket pocket. His leather wallet landed on the wet sidewalk with a soft thud, flipping open as it hit the ground. The gold seal of the city council caught the streetlight, gleaming brightly enough to catch Officer Wilson's eye. Davis?" Wilson's voice had suddenly lost its mocking tone. He lowered his phone and stepped closer to the wallet, shining his flashlight on the identification card. "You might want to see this." Davis paused and looked down. His face, previously full of arrogance, now paled as he read the card. Michael Chun, City Council Member, Chairman of the Police Oversight Committee. The change in the officer's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Davis quickly bent down, trying to help Michael up. "Sir, I'm so sorry. We had no idea who you were. Please let me help you." Michael rose slowly on his own, his legs stiff from the cold. His suit was ruined, with wet patches on the knees and elbows, his tie dripping with dirty slush, and small tears in the fabric from the rough pavement. He bent down to pick up his wallet, deliberately brushing it off with an air of calm. "Officer Wilson," Michael said softly, looking at the younger officer who was now frantically trying to delete the video from his phone. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. Destruction of evidence is a serious offense." Wilson's hand froze on the phone screen. Both officers stood in awkward silence as Michael brushed off his suit as best he could. The snow continued to fall around them, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone knew it. "Sir, please understand," Davis began, his voice now almost pleading. "This was just a routine stop that got a little out of hand. We meant no disrespect." Michael turned to face him, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "A routine stop for a taillight that wasn't actually broken, with both of your body cameras conveniently turned off." The officers exchanged nervous glances. Michael could see residents in the nearby buildings were still recording everything on their phones. He had a feeling these videos would be going viral on social media by morning. "Mr. Chun," Wilson stepped forward. "We can explain everything. Perhaps we could talk about this somewhere warmer. There's a coffee shop just down the street." "No, thank you," Michael replied, his voice carrying a chill colder than the winter air. "I think we've said enough for tonight." He walked back to his car, his shoes crunching with each step, leaving wet footprints in the snow. Before getting in, he turned to face the officers one last time. "Officers Davis and Wilson, I suggest you both prepare a detailed report of this incident. Include everything: the real reason you stopped me, why your body cameras were off, and why you thought it was appropriate to make a citizen do push-ups in freezing weather during a traffic stop." The officers stood motionless, knowing their careers might be over. Davis opened his mouth to say something, but Michael held up his hand. "Those reports are due in my office by 9 a.m. tomorrow," he continued. "And Officer Wilson, I require the full, unedited video from your phone to be included. Good night, gentlemen." Michael got into his car. The warmth of the heater enveloped his soaked suit as he drove away. He glanced in his rearview mirror as the two officers stood in the falling snow, looking like statues under the streetlights. They were unaware that their petty power play would lead to the biggest police reform their city had ever seen. Tomorrow would be a busy day at the city council, But tonight Michael had experienced something that would change not only his perspective, but also the future of the entire police department. Sometimes, he thought, the most powerful lessons come from the most humbling experiences. The heater in Michael's car was running at full blast, but he still couldn't stop shivering. His wet suit clung uncomfortably to his skin, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. The clock on his dashboard now read 12:30 a.m. as he drove through the quiet streets. The memory of the past hour replayed in his mind like a bad movie. The sound of Officer Davis's mocking laughter, the feel of the icy sidewalk on his hands, and the way his tie had dragged through the dirty slush. Every detail was etched into his memory. His phone started ringing on the passenger seat. It was probably Emily wondering where he was, but Michael couldn't bring himself to answer. How could he explain to his wife that her husband, a respected city council member, had been forced to do push-ups in the snow like a recruit in boot camp? At a red light, Michael caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. His usually neat black hair was wet and disheveled, and his face looked older than his 45 years. Small pebbles were still stuck to the sleeves of his suit jacket, and a dark, wet patch spread across his chest where the snow and slush had soaked through. Michael Chun, he said to himself, you just had to experience it firsthand. Didn't you? For years, he had attended countless community meetings where people complained about police harassment. He had listened, taken notes, and promised to look into their cases. But until tonight, he had never truly understood their helplessness. His phone rang again. This time it was a news alert. Someone had uploaded a video of the incident to social media. Michael watched a few seconds. The shaky footage showed him doing push-ups while the officers laughed. The video was getting views by the minute. As he turned onto his street, Michael noticed his hands had stopped shaking. The initial shock and humiliation were being replaced by something else. In his 15 years on the city council, he had never felt more certain about what needed to be done. He pulled into his driveway but didn't get out of the car right away. Instead, he reached for his briefcase and pulled out his tablet. Opening his email, he began to type. Emergency meeting notice, police oversight committee time. 9:30 a.m. tomorrow, location. City Council main chamber, subject. Review of recent police conduct and department policies, attendance. Mandatory. After sending the email, Michael started making calls. The first was to his assistant, Mary, who answered despite the late hour. Mary, I need all complaints filed against Officers Davis and Wilson from the past 5 years on my desk by 8 a.m. tomorrow, and get me the police department's body camera compliance reports for the past 6 months. Mary, accustomed to urgent requests, didn't ask any questions. Yes, sir. Anything else? Yes, Michael said, watching the snow continue to fall in his driveway. Contact it. I want all traffic camera footage from the intersection of Pine and 5th Street from 11:45 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. tonight. And Mary, thank you. Finally, Michael called the only person he knew would understand the significance of what had happened. His father, former police captain John Chun. The phone rang 3 times before his father's voice, still sharp despite his 70-something years, answered. Dad, Michael said, his voice slightly trembling. Remember all those times you told me about how power can corrupt good officers? I just experienced it firsthand. As Michael explained what had happened, his father listened silently. When he finished, the old captain paused for a long moment before speaking. Son, sometimes the worst experiences are the best fuel for change. What are you going to do with it? Michael looked at his ruined suit, then at his council badge lying on the passenger seat. I'm going to do what should have been done years ago, Dad. Tomorrow we start cleaning house. Finally stepping out of the car, Michael walked toward his front door. The house was dark except for the porch light Emily always left on for him. Tomorrow would bring a storm for the police department, but tonight he needed to hold his wife, warm up, and prepare for the battle ahead. The wet footprints he left on the porch would be gone by morning, but the impact of tonight would last much longer. At exactly 7 a.m., Michael walked into City Hall, looking very different from the man who had been doing push-ups in the snow just hours earlier. He was wearing his sharpest black suit, his lucky red tie, and carrying a thick folder of documents under his arm. The security guard at the entrance did a double take. Michael had never arrived this early. His assistant, Mary, was already at her desk, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she had been working all night. 5 stacks of papers were neatly arranged on her desk along with a large cup of coffee. "Good morning, Mr. Chun," she said, standing up. "I have everything you asked for. Officers Davis and Wilson have had 17 complaints filed against them in the past 5 years. None of them were properly investigated." She handed him the first stack of papers. Michael nodded, accepting the documents and the reports on body camera footage. Mary picked up another stack of papers. "There's an interesting pattern here. Both officers reported their cameras malfunctioning 12 times in the past 6 months. That's 4 times the department average." The office was starting to come alive as more staff arrived. Many looked at Michael with curiosity. The video from last night had gone viral. It already had over 100,000 views, and local news stations were playing it on their morning shows. Michael's phone hadn't stopped ringing since he woke up. The police chief had called 6 times, the mayor twice, and reporters from all the local news outlets were requesting comments. He had ignored them all. At 8:45 a.m., officers Davis and Wilson arrived at his office. They looked different in the daylight, smaller, less intimidating. Davis's usual swagger had been replaced by nervous fidgeting, and Wilson couldn't meet Michael's eyes. "Your reports," Michael asked simply, holding out his hand. The officers handed over their paperwork. Their hands trembled slightly, a stark contrast to their bravado of the previous night in the cold. "Sir," Davis began about last night. Michael cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Save it for the committee meeting in 45 minutes. I suggest you both be prepared." After they left, Michael read their reports. As expected, both officers attempted to downplay the incident. Davis claimed he was conducting a standard field sobriety test, while Wilson wrote that Michael had voluntarily performed the exercises. At 9:25 a.m., Michael walked into the city council's main chambers. The room was packed. All the committee members were present, along with dozens of citizens who had heard about the emergency meeting. Cameras from local news outlets lined the back. The police chief sat in the front row, his face flushed with anger or embarrassment, perhaps both. Officers Davis and Wilson sat nearby, now in full uniform, looking uncomfortable. Michael took his place at the center of the committee table. He arranged the documents in front of him. The complaint reports, the body camera logs, the traffic camera footage from last night, and the officers' false reports. "Before we begin," Michael said into the microphone, his voice calm but firm, "I want to thank Officers Davis and Wilson." The room fell silent in confusion. The 2 officers looked up in surprise. "Last night, these officers showed us exactly why we need major police reform in our city," Michael continued. "They didn't know they were dealing with a city council member. They thought I was just another citizen they could humiliate, and that's precisely the problem." He pressed a button, and the large screen behind him flickered to life. The traffic camera footage began to play, showing the entire incident from last night from multiple angles. The entire room watched in stunned silence. "Today," Michael said, his voice growing stronger, "we're not just going to talk about 2 officers abusing their power. We're going to talk about every officer who thinks a badge gives them the right to demean citizens. We're going to review every complaint that was swept under the rug, every body camera that mysteriously malfunctioned, and every false report that was filed." Looking directly at Officers Davis and Wilson, Michael added, "And we're going to start with last night." The room was utterly silent. All eyes were on Michael. The next few hours would change the city's police department forever, and everyone in the room could feel it. The meeting was about to begin, and justice would finally be served. Michael picked up the first folder on his desk, his movements deliberate and calm. The room remained quiet, filled with a tension as thick as the snowfall from the previous night. The cameras from the local news outlets whirred softly in the back, capturing every moment. "Let's start with Officer Davis's report," Michael said, his voice clear through the microphone. "According to this, you pulled me over for a routine traffic stop and suspected me of driving under the influence. Is that correct, Officer Davis?" Davis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His uniform suddenly seemed too tight around his collar. Yes, sir. That was my professional assessment at the time. Michael nodded and pressed another button. The large screen behind him displayed the traffic camera footage from the previous night. The clear images showed Michael's car driving perfectly within its lane, obeying all traffic laws. Interesting, Michael said, because the traffic camera shows me driving completely normally. No swerving, no speeding, and no broken taillight. He turned to face Davis. Would you like to amend your testimony? Before Davis could answer, Michael pulled out another document. And Officer Wilson, in your report, you state that I voluntarily performed exercises in the snow. Is that your official statement? Wilson's face had turned pale. The young officer glanced at his superior, Chief Williams, who was sitting red-faced in the front row, then back at Michael. I may have misremembered some details. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Michael played the video from a bystander's phone showing Davis ordering him to do push-ups while Wilson filmed and laughed. The sound of their mocking laughter echoed through the room. Misremembered, Michael repeated softly, just like you misremembered turning on your body camera. Just like you misremembered following proper traffic stop procedures. Sarah entered and handed Michael another folder. He opened it and addressed the entire room. In the past 5 years, these 2 officers have had 17 civilian complaints filed against them. Want to know how many were properly investigated? None. Chief Williams stood up, his face now a deep shade of purple. Mr. Chun, with all due respect, this seems like a personal vendetta because of one unfortunate incident. An incident? Michael interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that silenced the police chief. Let me ask the room. He turned to the crowd. How many people here have experienced similar treatment from our police department? Slowly, hands began to rise. First a few, then more, until nearly half the room had their hands raised. The news cameras panned across the crowd, capturing each raised hand. Each hand represents a story, Michael continued. Stories of humiliation, abuse of power, and fear. Stories that have been ignored or dismissed until now. He pulled out another document. This is a proposal for immediate police reform. It includes mandatory use of body cameras with severe penalties for non-compliance, civilian oversight of all complaint investigations, and immediate suspension for any officer found to have abused their power. Davis and Wilson sat slumped in their chairs, their previous arrogance completely gone. Chief Williams had stopped trying to defend them and was staring at his shoes. Officers Davis and Wilson, Michael said, you have 2 choices. You can resign effective immediately, or we can proceed with this investigation, which will include reviewing every complaint against you, every traffic stop you've made, and every report you've filed. The entire room held its breath. Davis, who had seemed so powerful last night in the snow, now looked small and defeated. Wilson was visibly sweating despite the cool room. We'll resign, Davis said quietly, his voice barely reaching the microphone. Michael nodded. A wise choice. He turned to Chief Williams. Chief, your department needs to be cleaned up. Either you can lead that change or we can find someone else who will. The police chief nodded stiffly, knowing his own job was now on the line. Michael picked up the police reform proposal. Members of the committee, it's time to vote. Last night showed us what happens in our city in the dark. Today, we bring everything into the light. One by one, the committee members raised their hands in support. The vote was unanimous. As Michael gathered his papers, he noticed his father sitting quietly at the back of the room. The old police captain gave his son a small, proud nod. Sometimes justice needs a push, or in this case, 30 push-ups in the snow to finally be served. News of Officers Davis and Wilson's resignation spread through the city like wildfire. By late afternoon, every local news station was running the story, showing clips from the committee meeting along with the viral video of Michael doing push-ups in the snow. Michael sat in his office, watching the news on a small TV while responding to hundreds of emails. People from all over the city were sharing their own stories of police harassment. His inbox was flooded with messages of support, more complaints about other officers, and thank yous from citizens who finally felt heard. Mr. Chun, Sarah called from the doorway. "The mayor wants to see you." Mayor entered, looking tired and worried. Gone was his usual confident stride, replaced with the cautious movements of someone approaching a sleeping lion. "Michael, we need to talk about what happened today." "Yes, we do," Michael replied, turning off the TV. "But first, I want you to see this." He opened his laptop and showed the mayor a spreadsheet. "These are all the civilian complaints filed against our police department in the past year. Over 300 cases, and only 8 were properly investigated." The mayor sank into a chair, loosening his tie. "I had no idea it was this bad." "Nobody did," Michael said, "because nobody wanted to look." He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the crowd of reporters still gathered outside City Hall. But now everyone's looking. His phone buzzed. Another text from his father. The retired police captain had been getting calls all day from his former colleagues. Some angry, some supportive. "The good officers are thanking you," his father's text read. "They've wanted change for years." A knock on the door interrupted them. It was Emily, Michael's wife, carrying a fresh suit bag. She had been his rock through this ordeal, proud of what he was doing, but worried about the backlash. "The press conference is in an hour," she reminded him gently. After setting down the suit bag, she took his hand. "You're doing the right thing." Michael changed into the new suit while the mayor paced nervously. "The police union is threatening to fight back," Mayor said. "They're saying you're on a witch hunt." "Let them," Michael replied, straightening his tie. "We have the evidence, we have the witnesses, and most importantly, we have the truth. It's time for real change." Just then, Sarah rushed in with breaking news. 2 more officers from a different precinct have resigned after citizens shared videos of similar abuse. The movement is spreading. At exactly 5 p.m., Michael stepped out to face the crowd of reporters on the steps of City Hall. Camera flashes lit up the early evening darkness like lightning strikes. Microphones were thrust at him from all directions. "Last night," Michael began, his voice strong and clear, "I experienced what many of our citizens have faced for years. But unlike many of them, I have the power to do something about it. Today, that changes." He held up a thick document. "The new police reform bill has been drafted and passed in record time. This is just the beginning. We're establishing a new civilian oversight board with real power. Every complaint will be investigated. Every officer will be held accountable." Reporters shouted questions, but Michael held up his hand for silence. "To the good police officers, the ones who serve our city with honor, we support you. To those who abuse their power, your time is up." In the crowd, he spotted Officer Wilson's wife crying quietly. Michael felt a moment of compassion. Actions have consequences, and families often pay the price. But he remembered the countless other families who had suffered because of police misconduct. "Change isn't easy," he continued, "but it's necessary. Starting tomorrow, we begin training our police force in de-escalation techniques. Body cameras will be mandatory and checked daily. Community involvement will be mandatory, not optional." As he finished speaking, someone in the crowd began to clap. The applause spread until it echoed off the walls of City Hall. In the back, Michael saw his father standing tall and proud, just as he used to stand in his police captain uniform. The sun was setting behind the city buildings, casting long shadows on the steps, but unlike the shadows of last night, these shadows didn't conceal abuse of power. They marked the end of an old era and the beginning of a new one. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more resistance, and more work. But tonight, standing on those steps, Michael Chin knew that sometimes the worst experiences can lead to the best changes. 6 months had passed since that freezing winter night when Michael Chun was forced to do push-ups in the snow. The city had changed in ways that even he hadn't imagined. On a warm summer morning, Michael stood at the podium in the police academy's graduation hall. In front of him were 50 newly trained police officers, trained under the reform system he had helped create. Behind them, proud families filled the seats, and among them were former officers Davis and Wilson. The 2 former officers hadn't disappeared after. They resigned. Instead, something unexpected had happened. 3 months ago, Davis had contacted Michael with a surprising request. He wanted to help train new officers on what not to do. Wilson had joined him, and together they shared their story as a powerful lesson on abuse of power. "Look at the person sitting next to you," Michael began his speech. "That person is not just your colleague. They are your conscience, your witness, and a reminder of what it means to be a good police officer." The new graduating class looked different from years past. There were more women, more minorities, and each had completed extensive community service as part of their training. They had worked in homeless shelters, youth centers, and nursing homes before ever touching a badge. 6 months ago, I stood in the snow, humiliated by officers who had forgotten their true purpose. Michael continued. Today, I stand here proudly seeing officers who understand that a badge is not a weapon, but a symbol of trust. In the front row, Chief Williams nodded. He had surprised everyone by supporting the reforms. After initial resistance, he had become one of their strongest advocates, firing 12 officers for misconduct and promoting those who demonstrated true community leadership. Mary, Michael's assistant, approached and handed him some papers. They were the latest statistics that had just been printed. Michael smiled as he read them to the crowd. In the past 6 months, civilian complaints have dropped by 70%. Community trust in the police has increased by 65%. Response times have improved, and most importantly, both citizens and officers report feeling safer. Davis shifted in his seat, his face a mix of shame and hope. His teenage son sat beside him, watching the new officers with admiration. Wilson's wife, who had cried at the press conference 6 months ago, was now smiling, her hand resting on her husband's shoulder. "But the most important change," Michael said, "isn't in these numbers. It's in the stories I no longer hear, the stories of fear, humiliation, and abuse of power. Instead, I hear new stories of officers helping elderly residents with their shopping, playing basketball with kids in the neighborhood, and truly serving their community." Michael's father sat in the back, wearing his old police captain uniform. He had been instrumental in designing the new training program, sharing his 40 years of experience on what it truly meant to be a good police officer. "Today, as you receive your badges," Michael continued, "remember this. Power is not measured by how many push-ups you can make someone do or how much fear you can instill. True power comes from how many lives you can improve, how many people you can help, and how much trust you can build." The ceremony ended with something new. Each officer took an oath, not just to uphold the law, but to serve the community with respect, dignity, and compassion. As they received their badges, each was paired with a civilian mentor who would work with them for their first year. After the ceremony, Davis approached Michael. "Mr. Chun," he said, looking down at his feet, "I never properly apologized for that night. What we did was wrong. Thank you for turning it into something good." Michael shook his hand. Sometimes our worst mistakes can lead to the best changes. As Michael walked out of the academy building, he saw 2 new officers helping an elderly woman cross the street with her groceries. On another corner, an officer was showing neighborhood kids how to use the radio in their patrol car. His phone buzzed. Another city had called, wanting to learn about their reform program. The changes they had made were spreading, creating ripples far beyond their city limits. That night, with the snow turned to summer stars, Michael drove past the spot where he had done push-ups 6 months earlier. A new community police center stood there now, its windows warm and welcoming. Inside, officers and citizens sat together, not as those with power and those without, but as partners in making their city better. Sometimes, Michael thought, 30 push-ups in the snow can change the world, or at least start the process. This story is a powerful reminder that justice sometimes needs a personal sacrifice to be served. If you were Marcus, what would you do after this experience? Have you ever faced an unjust situation and stood up for what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments. You never know, your story might inspire someone else. If you found this story meaningful, don't hesitate to share it with your friends and family to spread the message of responsibility, integrity, and positive change. Let more people understand that power is not in imposing, but in using it to build a more just community. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because tomorrow we will bring you another inspiring story. Together, we can create small but meaningful changes. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared for the purpose of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any errors, please ignore with understanding. I wish you all the best in life.